Are Philippine lawmakers overstepping their power when they cite witnesses for contempt in legislative hearings? In recent days, we've seen an increase in high-profile Senate and House of Representatives inquiries, where witnesses, whether private individuals, public officials, or business leaders, are cited for contempt. Some have been detained, held in contempt for refusing to testify, providing evasive answers, or failing to submit documents. With such significant powers at their disposal, the question arises: are Philippine lawmakers going beyond their legal authority when they cite people for contempt during legislative hearings? This is a critical issue that everyone, from legal practitioners to ordinary citizens, should understand. Knowing your rights and the limits of legislative power could help you avoid legal pitfalls if you are ever summoned to testify in Congress. Before we dive into this important topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more legal insights. Stay updated on your rights and legal issues that could impact your life and profession.
The power of contempt in legislative inquiries. The power to cite individuals for contempt is essential for legislative bodies like the Senate and House of Representatives in the Philippines. It ensures that witnesses comply with investigations in aid of legislation. However, there are questions about how far this power can go, and whether lawmakers might be overreaching in some instances. Legal basis for legislative contempt. Under the 1987 Philippine Constitution, both the Senate and House of Representatives have the power to conduct inquiries in aid of legislation, Section 21, Article 6. The rules that govern these inquiries allow for witnesses to be cited in contempt if they fail to cooperate. For the Senate, this is outlined in Rule 18, Section 18 of the Rules of Procedure governing inquiries in aid of legislation. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives follows Section 11 of its own rules on legislative inquiries. Contempt can be cited in the following situations: 1. Disobedience to an order from the legislative body; 2. Refusal to testify or be sworn in; 3. Providing evasive or false testimony; 4. Failure to appear or submit required documents when subpoenaed. The goal of these provisions is to compel cooperation and ensure the integrity of legislative inquiries. However, concerns arise when individuals are detained for extended periods or when lawmakers appear to use contempt as a tool for coercion. Recent controversies, high-profile cases of contempt. A notable example occurred during the Senate's investigation into the Pharmally Pharmaceutical Corporation in 2021. Witnesses were held in contempt and detained after refusing to provide documents or answer questions related to the alleged mishandling of pandemic funds. This case brought attention to the extent of the Senate's power, as several individuals were detained for months, raising the question: are these powers being used fairly or abused? While the Senate and House argue that these actions are necessary to obtain the truth, critics claim that the prolonged detention of witnesses may infringe upon constitutional rights, such as the right to due process and protection against self-incrimination.
The limits of legislative contempt, constitutional boundaries in jurisprudence. The Supreme Court has weighed in on the limits of legislative contempt powers in key cases. Let's explore some of the most relevant jurisprudence.
Arvin Balag vs. Senate of the Philippines, GR number 234608, 2018. Another recent case that shed light on the limits of legislative contempt was Arvin Balag vs. Senate of the Philippines. During an investigation into hazing-related deaths, Arvin Balag was cited for contempt and detained for refusing to testify. The Supreme Court ruled that while the Senate can cite individuals for contempt during inquiries in aid of legislation, detention should last only until the inquiry is completed. Once the legislative body finishes its investigation, the detention must end, either upon the submission of the committee report or the termination of the Congress. This ruling highlighted that the power to detain witnesses for contempt cannot be used punitively or for purposes beyond legislative inquiry. Instead, it must be limited to compelling testimony necessary for lawmaking.
Comparison to contempt in judicial proceedings. While lawmakers possess contempt powers, these are not as broad as the powers held by courts under Rule 71 of the Rules of Court, which governs judicial contempt. There are two types of contempt recognized by the courts: direct and indirect contempt. Direct contempt refers to acts of disrespect or disobedience committed in the presence of the court, e.g., shouting at a judge or refusing to comply with court orders. In such cases, courts can immediately punish the individual without a formal hearing. Indirect contempt involves acts committed outside the presence of the court that defy its authority, e.g., failure to comply with a court ruling. Indirect contempt requires a formal charge and hearing before penalties can be imposed. The case of attorney Lorenzo Gadon, AC number 13521, 2023, exemplifies the serious consequences of indirect contempt. Gadon was disbarred after repeatedly committing contemptuous acts, including using offensive language and disobeying court orders. The courts emphasized that contempt powers must be used to preserve the dignity and authority of the judiciary, not as a tool for retaliation.
Are lawmakers overstepping their powers? This brings us back to the key question: are Philippine lawmakers overstepping their power when they cite witnesses for contempt? On one hand, legislative contempt is essential for lawmakers to carry out investigations effectively. Without it, witnesses could evade testimony, withhold documents, or obstruct investigations. However, the detention of witnesses for long periods without clear justification raises concerns about the abuse of this power. The Supreme Court has made it clear that while Congress holds contempt powers, these should not be used punitively, but rather to compel compliance. Any misuse could lead to violations of constitutional rights, such as due process and protection from self-incrimination. Should legislative bodies in the Philippines be allowed to detain witnesses for contempt beyond the duration of their investigations, or should this power be more strictly limited to prevent abuse? If you want to learn more about your rights and the powers of legislative and judicial bodies in the Philippines, subscribe to our channel now. Stay informed and protect yourself from potential legal pitfalls by understanding the law better. Hit the notification bell for the latest updates.